Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I'm going to catch you up on some photography that I did earlier this week during my trip up the North Yorkshire coast. I want to treat this video as a little bit of a photography guide, and I want to explain how I approached photographing this particular location, some things that I think about when I do visit new places that hopefully you can implement into your own photography the next time you're out on a trip and you're trying to find things to photograph. Now, the North Yorkshire coast has been on my bucket list for a long time. It's such an amazing coastline with so many interesting places to visit along the way, and in this video I'm just going to focus on one particular location, and that is the fishing town of Staithes. So you may well have already seen photos of Staithes. It's such a picturesque fishing town. You have these traditional red tiled roofs, you've got the harbour, and all of these narrow cobbled streets. It's these elements that make it such a wonderful place for photography, because there are so many aspects of photography that can be done just in this very small place. So I spent a good couple of hours maybe just wandering around, and in this video I'm going to share some of my favourite photos and explain what drew me to take those photos in the first place. So I want to start by talking about the history of the town itself. I'm particularly drawn to telling stories through my photos, and I'm treating my photography outings as small projects in themselves. I typically will go to a place and I'll have an idea in my mind of a kind of body or gallery of work that I want to create in that place that is normally based around a particular theme. And for me, it's just a way that I can have a sort of mission statement to work from. So when I'm looking for compositions, I at least have some idea of what I'm looking for in terms of the photographic style or the subject matter. And somewhere like Staithes is a perfect place for that because it has such a rich history. At the turn of the 20th century, there were 80 fishing boats working out of Staithes Harbour, and it was one of the biggest ports in the northeast. Coupled with the fact that Staithes was a bit of a hotspot for artists during that same era. There was a colony of up to 40 artists that were permanently living in Staithes for a period of time, and they were making work purely in that one village, taking their inspiration from the cobbled streets, the red brick roofs of the buildings, and the harbour itself. And these two elements became a bit of a focal point for my photography project when I was walking around looking for compositions. So if you want to visit Staithes yourself, you'll notice that the car park is at the very top of the town, and you have to walk downhill, which gives you a great vantage point as you enter the town of the harbour, all of those really traditional red brick roofed buildings, the boats, and that led to my first composition, which was kind of a postcard shot, but it was one that really kind of established the scene that we were going to be working in. This composition led to a kind of shot within a shot, because the grand vista gives you that establishing scene of the location itself. But the real points of interest were those traditional red brick roofs that you find in a lot of these small settlements on the Yorkshire coast. So what I then did was kind of honed in on particular compositions within the buildings of the town to really kind of focus on that element of history. So it was using a longer focal length. I was probably right in at around 75mm, and I was just trying to find little collections of buildings that sort of looked quite good together. So I tried some in a portrait orientation, I tried some in a bit more of a landscape orientation, and I felt that provided an extra layer into sort of telling the story of this particular place. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Staithes was a real hotspot for fishing, and a little walk down to the harbour just enabled me to really focus in on that particular aspect of this little photography project. Along the harbour front, there were loads of lobster pots and loads of fishing equipment that made for another great photo to help sort of tell the story of why this particular location was of interest. So there were a few different approaches that I took here, which again might be useful to yourselves when you're looking at documenting a particular location. So this first shot is just of the actual equipment itself. It's just a few lobster pots with some buoys, and it just creates a nice little sort of harbour-side scene. What I then wanted to do was incorporate this equipment, but in the larger context of what that equipment was used for. So I started to use that as a bit of a framing tool, and then I took this photo, which is using the lobster pots to frame the fishing boats that are in the background of the frame. It adds a lot more depth, which I quite liked. I could have taken this photo without the lobster pots in the foreground, you know, slightly blurred out by a wider aperture. I was probably at around f4.5 for this particular photo, but I just feel like having them there tells a much better story and it adds a lot more depth. So always think about that when you're trying to find compositions. How can you make them more interesting? How can you create more depth? And not just using depth, you know, for the sake of it, but including something that actually adds to the photo in a kind of storytelling aspect. So I mentioned earlier that Staithes was a bit of a hotspot for artists during the 20th century, and whilst I was there, I was looking through a few of the galleries, and I kind of was using some of those pieces of artwork as inspirations for subjects, because although artists can have a little bit more freedom because they can choose to include or kind of manipulate the actual true sense of a composition just by the virtue of, you know, painting from imagination, and we don't necessarily have that ability as photographers, those artists tended to focus more on the comings and goings and the real lifestyle element of the town in their work, and that's something that I wanted to try and convey. We've already done that a little bit by showing the sort of fishing community, we've done that by showing the architecture using the roofs, but what I wanted to also showcase was some of the actual landscape around that. There was this real kind of like interesting river estuary that led into the harbour. You would have seen it in the first photo that I showed as part of this series, but there were some stranded boats in there. And again, it was just a really nice opportunity to, again, tell a story of what was going on in this particular town at that time. The bridge that crosses the river provides some really good framing options, and I managed to get a couple of shots here that sort of were a bit of an homage to some of the artwork that you would have seen from the artists at that time. So although I only spent a couple of hours in Staithes, and an enjoyable couple of hours it certainly was, I wanted to make sure that I came away with a gallery of images that even if I showed it to somebody who had never been there before, they'd get a real sense of what that location and what that town was like. It was just a case of including things like large establishing vista shots, more intimate details, and trying to evoke a sense of story by emphasizing certain things about that location that it is well known for. And hopefully that's something that you can take onto your next trip. If you're just doing it as an exercise, it's just really valuable. It enables you to be creative, it enables you to make sure that you come away with a body of work, and it's just a really useful skill to have, because if you ever want to make photo books or magazines, or even if you're wanting to submit work to magazines for particular stories or features, then being able to collectively show a series of images that, you know, all together provide a really good sense of story, or, you know, paint a very good picture, then as a photographer, I just think it's a valuable skill to have. So it was a fun little couple of hours. There's loads of photos that I'm sharing on Instagram at the moment from that trip. I did spend 3 days on the coast and I visited quite a few places. So if you're not following me on Instagram, do so by going to the link in the description and have a look at some of the work that I created. I will try and maybe do some more videos on the channel from Yorkshire, but do let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think of the images. As always, thank you so much for watching. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all next Thursday for another video.